First Samuel is in the Old Testament toward the front. If you're using a hard-backed black Bible that's somewhere near you, 1 Samuel will be on page 229. And we'll just be in chapter 1, starting in verse 1 through 2, verse 11. And it's maybe feels like a big chunk, but it's a great story, and I want to hold it together because I think in this we get the opening characters and setting, and we actually get the theme of the whole book. And so I want to just look at these verses together as we work through this. So we have some opening characters. Let me read the first couple of verses here. There was a certain man from Ramoth, a Zephulite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeram, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zoph, an Ephraimite, sorry about that. He had two wives. One of them was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. All right, help me out. Who are the characters we have so far? Hannah, great. You picked an easy one. Yep. Elkanah, however you've heard it said. Yep. Peninnah. All right, so we basically have three characters. We have this man, Elkanah, who lives in Ramah, and he has two wives. So who is Hannah? It's not a trick question. One of the wives. Yep, one of the wives. One of two wives. And what is Hannah's issue? She's barren. Okay. I'm not asking trick questions, really. I'm not trying to set you up. Does this remind you of any other story? Okay. Yep. Great. You jumped New Testament. Let's think Old Testament. Any other Old Testament story that this might sound a little bit like? Yeah, like. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Abraham and Sarah. Yep. And then we get Jacob and Rebekah. Yeah. And so I hope that we're kind of picking up on, this is a reoccurring situation. And we've actually seen God work in these situations. So what happens in the story of Abraham and Sarah? Yeah, George, stay out of this. Okay, yep. Okay, yeah. Sarah's like, hey, why don't you take my slave woman and make her your wife and have a child with her? Now, this text doesn't tell us that has any, bearing, but the fact that it lists Hannah first would suggest Hannah's the first wife. And if she has no children, and Elkanah goes, oh, wow, how is my legacy going to continue? He takes a second wife. Men, one wife. It's a good thing. Two wives always gets problematic. So if you have one, stick with one. All right, if we move forward to the story of Jacob, now Jacob, he loves one of Laban's daughters. But he's given the other one, right? So there's some trickery going on. He ends up working for 14 years to have them both, Leah and Rachel. And he loves one, and he has children with the other. So let me just continue on here, verse 3. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters, but to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed up her womb. Okay, so what do we learn about our characters now? Anything that we learn about Elkanah? Okay. Okay. What else do we learn about him? Mm-hmm.
So there's a certain godliness about that because he not only just do for his family, but he wants the family to learn to do for themselves as well, coming to God's presence.
Okay, so year after year, this man, he goes up to Shiloh to make sacrifices. All right, so just a little map of where we're at. I'll zoom in here in a second, but just to give a little bit of context, the setting of this book. So if we go Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers. What comes after Numbers? I'm sorry, Numbers, Deuteronomy, thank you. What comes after Deuteronomy? Okay, and then? Okay, and then? Okay, all right, we're tracking now. All right, so we have the book of Joshua. Joshua goes into the land. So we've had the exodus from Egypt. We have a formation of Israel. We have the purification of Israel, where one generation dies in the wilderness. The next generation is brought up, and Joshua is made a leader. And they come into the promised land through Jericho. And then they conquer the land, or they're moving into the land. And Joshua sends out men, and he goes, hey, you need to go map the area. And it's Shiloh where he gathers that contingent. It's also Shiloh where they set up the tent of God. And so from Joshua's day to Elkanah's day, Shiloh's the place of worship. People are going to Shiloh. What happens in Judges? If you had to sum up the book of Joshua or Judges in one phrase, what might it be? Okay. Okay. Self-reliance, failure, dependence on God. It is a cycle that way. A phrase that comes up over and over and over again in the book of Judges is, and the people did what was right in their own eyes. And so you have like the tribe of Dan, that they're going into their allotted portion, and they have an allotted portion. You can see it toward the lower left side. Dan has an allotted portion, but we kind of learn that they can't actually conquer it. They don't take it. And so they pick one town, and they're like, we'll take that town. That'll be our town. And they end up doing that. They find a guy named Micah, not the prophet, but a Levite who is acting as priest in the area. And they're like, hey, you have what it takes to be a priest, and you have some idols. We don't really want to go up to Shiloh, even though it's not that far for the tribe of Dan. We want to worship here. And the book of Judges tells us that from Joshua all the way to the current time, the tribe of Dan, they just worshiped where they were. They didn't go up to Shiloh. And that was true in the lives of many of the Israelites. They just set up their own camp of worship because of this cycle in the Judges where over and over and over again the people did what was right in their own eyes. They worshiped their own idols. They practiced religion in their own way. But then we get this guy named Elkanah. And year after year, he goes up to Shiloh. Year after year, he's being faithful to go worship the Lord. Glad you ask. So Ephraim is kind of a big region. He lives down in Ramah. And so the borderline there was a little bit fuzzier in Elkanah's day. But you can see Ramah, you'd go up through Bethel, up into Shiloh. So he had to travel north a little bit away. So that red dot is Ramah, the yellow dot is Bethel, and the green dot is Shiloh. Yeah, 2 or 3 days. So it's not absurd. It's not a huge sacrifice, but the pattern that's suggested in the text is that he's a faithful guy. He's trying to practice his religion, his faith. So I want to push just a little bit on what we might see as favoritism. Because I think he's faithful, and I think it's interesting, the phrasing, at least in the NIV, how it's said. It says in verse 5, but to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her. Okay, we might go, yep, she's the favorite. It doesn't tell us that he didn't love Peninnah. And he gives Peninnah what she needs, and he gives her children, his children, what they need. But the next phrase is really interesting. And the Lord had closed up her womb. He gives her a double portion because the Lord had closed up her womb. And I think we begin to see how the human heart tends to react to challenging times. So Elkanah is like, hey, we're going to get a little bit more of this in just a couple verses. I understand you're having a really difficult time. Let me try to meet that need. Let me give you a double portion because you're suffering. So is his favoritism really motivated by a certain kind of love? He loves her more than Peninnah. I don't think the text tells us that, though we might assume that. Or is his favoritism this attempt to meet the need of one suffering? Now, I think we are called to meet the need of those suffering. But I wonder if Elkanah has crossed a line. So let's just keep reading here. We'll pick up again verse 6. Because the Lord closed Hannah's womb. All right, we have this other character that we should probably talk about. Who's the other character right now in the story? We have Elkanah, we have Peninnah, we have Hannah. Who's our fourth character? The Lord. The Lord had closed up her womb. It's so interesting if we think about the story of Abraham and Sarah, if we think about Jacob and Rachel. We're told these things, that these women were barren, and yet we're told that God is faithful. God had made a promise to Abraham. God had made a promise to Jacob. In fact, God made the same promise that he made to Abraham to Jacob in Bethel twice. And so something should be kind of perking up in our minds as we read these words. Because what God wanted to do with Sarah's barrenness was actually on purpose. He wanted to show his great and mighty power. He wanted to show his faithfulness. He wanted Abraham to trust him more and more and more. Same thing for Jacob. When Jacob realizes that Rachel is barren, he cries out to the Lord, Lord, will you heal her? Will you change this? And the Lord answers his prayer. So Elkanah is a faithful man, I would argue. He's taking this journey. I don't think it's lost on him as he goes through Bethel. He would have passed an altar that Jacob built to the faithfulness of God. And yet, even though there seems to be purpose in what God does, it's very clear here in the text, the Lord closed up her womb. He has a plan. He's working out his plan. Verse 7 says, this went on year after year. So this is their pattern, year after year, as Elkanah is trying to work out his faithfulness. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept, and she would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Here's what I would contend Elkanah is doing. Even though he walks past an altar to the faithfulness of God, even though in the patriarchs of Abraham and of Jacob, this is a story, this is a recurring theme. Hey, would you trust me in this? He is trying to meet Hannah's need. We're not told that Elkanah goes to the Lord to say, Lord, would you heal my wife? Lord, would you bring about children through her? Lord, in your great faithfulness, would you help us in this season to stand firm, to wait for you, to watch for what you're going to do? And I think oftentimes in our flesh, in our weakness, in our struggle, we are prone to do the same thing. When someone we love is going through a hard time, we're prone to go, hey, can I fix it? And how can I fix it? Oh, maybe if I give a little bit more of this, maybe if I give a little bit more of that, maybe if we try this or try that. And oftentimes, we forget to pray. We forget to trust. We forget that God is faithful. Now, there's the other end of this. We see that in Peninnah. What does Peninnah do to Hannah? Provokes her bitterly. What might that look like? How would you describe that? Just play it out. Give me a scenario. Bullying, teasing. I mean, Peninnah, all the way up, like they're on this journey from Ramah to Shiloh, and all the way up, she's like, I have kids. Look at this whole train of children behind me, and you have none. Peninnah just over and over, year after year after year, just pokes and prods and makes fun of. Yep, puts in the screws and just keeps twisting. She wants her to suffer. And I think in our flesh, we tend to go one of those two ways. When somebody's suffering, when there seems to be this inequity, and so Peninnah sees Elkanah say, hey, here's a double portion, Hannah, because he's trying to be all that she needs. And it provokes jealousy in Peninnah. And the way that she can respond to that is to tease Hannah. And there's pride on both sides. Like for Elkanah to believe that he is enough, for him to believe, hey, aren't I better than 10 sons? There's pride in that. I'm enough for you, Hannah, right? And in Peninnah, there's pride in her. I don't want you to get anything special. You're nothing special. Look at all of my children. I have the children. I should be the special one. I should be the favored one. And I'm going to remind you all the time. And there's pride. Verse 9. Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. All right, so when they would go up to Shiloh to offer a sacrifice at the tent of meeting, they would probably camp out somewhere close. They would take all that they needed for the allotted days that they were going to be there to make the sacrifice. And they would be camping somewhere near the tent of meeting. They would make their sacrifice, and the priests would give back the meat that was apportioned to them to eat. And Elkanah would dole that out to his family. And while they're eating there, Hannah, she's refusing to eat. She's probably weeping again because Peninnah has been mean. And Elkanah is just like, aren't I enough? And finally, she just stands up and she goes back to the house of meeting. She goes back to the tabernacle. And Eli is sitting at the doorpost or at his post, wherever that might be. And she's crying out to the Lord. She's praying. She has decided, you know what? Elkanah is not enough. Now that may sound harsh. He's been very kind to her, but she realizes no human being can meet my deepest need. No matter how good he is, no matter how faithful he is, no human can meet her need. And she's so weary of being picked on that she goes, okay, where can I turn? And she turns to the Lord. And she made a vow saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and said to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. It's interesting, oftentimes I think we can fall into this trap too. When somebody is desperate for the Lord, we're like, you are so crazy. You're so extreme. When somebody is actually like, the Lord is the only one that can meet my need. The Lord is where I'm going to turn. And they're crying out to the Lord. We're prone to go, man, that's radical. That's too radical. Or maybe it's too simple. People must be delusional to believe that God can enter into our circumstances and actually change things. They must be delusional to believe that prayer, silent prayer or aloud prayer, changes anything. You ever felt that people might think that of you? You ever had somebody who you say, hey, could I pray for you? Go, that doesn't do anything. Or maybe in our current place, we come to church and we go, man, we should pray about that. We go, yeah, we can pray about that, but then what are we going to do? How are we going to make the change? Do we believe that prayer changes things? To the point that we're willing to actually sit there and beg God for what we need. Even if other people go, man, you're crazy, that's nuts. Why are you going to prayer meeting again? What, you went to a Sunday service and all you did was pray? That's nuts. So we can fall into the trap of believing that we're enough for somebody. We can fall into the trap of jealousy where we're like, they don't deserve anything. We can fall into the trap of thinking, man, that's just crazy to believe that God might work. But Eli says, go on your way. And may the God grant you what you've asked for. And there is instant change in Hannah. Here's the truth, and here's God's promise. God declares that if you will seek Him with all your heart, you will find Him. He will be found. He will show Himself to you, and that experience changes people. And so Hannah, she goes and prays at the tabernacle, and she comes home, and she eats, and she's smiling, and she's no longer downcast. What a testimony, right? Elkanah had to be like, what happened? Peninnah had to be like, what happened? And here's what I believe to be true. with all my heart, when we are willing to experience God's love and hope in our lives, it will change us in a way that is outwardly displayed to the world in powerful ways. And people will begin to ask, what happened? Early the next morning they arose and they worshiped before the Lord, and then they went back to their home in Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." All right, I'm going to just summarize this next chunk. Samuel is born. She gives birth. She names him Samuel. She's nursing him, and it's that time of year again. And Elkanah goes, "Hey, it's time to go." And she's like, I'm not going to go until the baby's weaned. He's like, it makes sense. That makes sense. And so eventually Samuel is old enough that he is weaned, and Hannah takes a bull that's 3 years old and goes up to the temple and makes a sacrifice and presents Samuel to Eli. Now there's some things that are going to unfold in Eli's life that make this really poignant. This is unique. I try to put myself in Eli, when I think about this, and this woman who now it's probably been 3 years, 2 at least, but probably 3. I don't know if I'd remember the crazy woman that was praying at the altar. But this woman comes and says, "Hey, do you remember me?" And maybe he goes, yeah, maybe. Maybe the Lord put her back on his mind. Maybe he had thought of her often just to go, I wonder if God answered her prayer. I don't know. But she shows up and she's like, "Here's my son, and I'm going to dedicate him to the Lord. So he's all yours." What? Eli's fairly old at this point. I don't want your kid. But what we're going to read is his 2 sons end up dying fairly soon after this. And so now, God's already provided him another son. It happens in this perfect course of action. It happens at this perfect time. It happens in this perfect way to set up God's plan. The Lord does things on purpose. The Lord is in control of everything. And I hope that brings us a measure of peace. That this story, we go, the Lord closed her womb. It was on purpose. And he opened her womb at the exact right time. And would she have cried out to him unless she was so desperate, unless Peninnah had been so mean, unless Elkanah had been so appeasing, unless all of these things had played themselves out over time, would she have cried out to the Lord like that? Would she have seen God's hand in that? Man, Abraham and Sarah, they're never the same. Sarah's going to have a child. Why are you laughing, Sarah? Because I don't believe it. Because I'm old. Nothing's impossible for God. I have a plan. I'm working out my plan. And you're going to learn dependence on me. You're going to learn about my great faithfulness to you in this act. And Hannah's learning that. And Eli's learning that. And Samuel's learning that. God is faithful. God's in control. And he's bringing about exactly what he desires for his purposes. But we're called to trust in the midst of that, because sometimes his purposes don't make sense to us. And sometimes in the waiting, it gets really, really hard, and we fall into those traps. We fall into those traps of, well, isn't this other thing enough? Can't you be satisfied with that? Oh, you're getting special treatment because you're having such a hard time. And jealousy rises up, bitterness rises up, and then we're just reacting that way. Or maybe we get to a point where we go, prayer doesn't do anything. Because I've prayed and I've prayed and I've prayed and nothing's happened. Can we hold on to the fact that God is faithful? Can we hold on to the fact that God is in control? Can we hold on to the reality that his ways are not our ways? His thoughts are not our thoughts. His timing is not our timing. But he has a plan, and we're seeing it worked out in this text. She says in verse 20, or 28, right at the end of chapter 1, so now I give him to the Lord for his whole life, and he will be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. Then Hannah prayed and said, and I want you just to listen to her prayer because I think it reveals the theme of the book. And we've already seen this in motion. We're going to see this play out in the nation of Israel. We're going to see this play out in Saul's life. We're going to see this play out in David's life. But here's the theme of 1 Samuel. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Let's listen to her prayer. My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one beside him. There is no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance. For the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warrior are broken, but those who stumble are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who were hungry are hungry no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust, and he lifts the needy from the ash heap. He sets them with princes and has them inherit the throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. On them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful servants, but the wicked he will silence in their place of darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. Did you hear it in there? Man, we get so many good nuggets in there of how this is going to play out, not only in the book of 1 Samuel, then in the book of 2 Samuel, but in the history of Israel, all the way up to Jesus. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. This theme is stated so clearly here, and then it ripples through the rest of scriptures from this point. And I think it's something we need to tune our hearts to, especially in these months. Let's pray. Father, thank you for how you work in the lives of people. And Lord, we don't know for sure who wrote these things down in 1 and 2 Samuel. But Father, I'm so thankful that you have chosen to preserve your message to us, your revelation to us, in and through the lives of ordinary people. Father, I thank you for these ripples of your storyline, that we should sit up and pay attention, that, oh, here we are again, a man with 2 wives, one is bearing children, one is not. What is God going to do? Lord, it picks up your storyline again after a period where everyone was just doing whatever they wanted. And then here we go again. God is on the move. And he's working in and through people. He's working in and through leaders. He's working in and through nations. But Father, I pray that we would hear that it's not in our strength. Elkanah was not enough. And it's not in our might. Peninnah was not enough. Her strength was not enough. She couldn't tease Hannah enough. But it is by the Lord. Father, the way that you work, how you have called your people to engage in this world is crazy. You've called us to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us. You've called us to turn the other cheek and to lay down our lives. You've called us to kindness and compassion, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. You've called us to love. You've called us to unity. And to the world, those things seem so weak. Lord, you've called us to pray. Lord, I ask that you would guard our hearts against believing that prayer is ineffective. Lord, you declare that you are close to the brokenhearted. You bind up those who are crushed in spirit. Lord, help us to take that to heart as we see that in the vivid display of these people's lives. Father, as we go through this book, I pray that you would teach us through the contrasts that this author has captured between Israel and the Philistines, between Saul and David. I pray that we would see and come to understand and believe and act on that you oppose the proud, but you give grace to the humble. Thank you that that is true. Help us to live in that. Today, this week, into these next months, we'll give you thanks for it. In Christ's name. Amen.